And so, welcome everybody. Again, I saw many familiar faces from our previous sessions as well as some new ones today, but we're thrilled that you could join us for our third webinar focused on community wealth building powered by RBC. So to generate healthy communities, we need to ensure that everyone has opportunities to participate and contribute. Today, we're going to learn about community benefit agreements and how they can be used as a tool to ensure equitable employment outcomes, social procurement avenues, environmental sustainability, resident empowerment, and more. Really themes that we've covered in our earlier webinar series as well. Community benefits agreements are one of the tools of community wealth building and a way we can break down barriers and create opportunities for people who are left behind by our existing economic systems. My name is Shannon Bruce, and I am the Director of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, as well as Interim Regional Director for Lanark County here at United Way East Ontario. And I'm really pleased today to be your MC again for our third webinar on community wealth building. I do want to acknowledge before we start that it is with profound respect that we have the privilege to be operating and performing on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. We recognize the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island who have been thriving on this land for centuries. And we recognize that this event falls during National Indigenous History Month, a time to celebrate and honor the contributions of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people to our communities. This month and throughout the year, we recognize Canada's history of colonization and the ongoing violence against Indigenous peoples and their culture. As guests on this land, we promise to walk gently and with respect. So while I have the opportunity, and before we start with our guests today, I want to run through some Zoom reminders so that we're all comfortable and get the most out of the platform. So you can use the chat box function at any point to get our team's attention and help should you need it. So we ask that you please ensure that you're on mute during the event. And given the size of our event today, we'll encourage you to use the chat box to ask questions or comment. But of course, the option of unmuting yourself is always there, particularly when we get to our Q&A panel afterwards. For you tweeters out there, our hashtag for today is #BuildingCommunityWealth. And I encourage that if you hear a great idea or something comes to mind for yourself, let's share it on social to get others thinking about it as well. We also understand that being on camera for a lengthy period of time can be challenging. So please feel free to turn it off and on at your leisure. And if possible, though, try to be on if you're asking a question to one of our panelists. We'll also look to take a set of photos for those who are okay being in a photo and may grab some screenshots of our presenters throughout the event. And lastly, we've already mentioned this, but this event is being recorded and we'll look to share it afterwards for those who want to revisit the content or share it with their teams. So right now, before we get started, we'd like to grab a photo of our participants and our speakers today. And if you'd like to be in the photo, we ask that you please turn your camera on, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Haley Robideau, to take the picture.
Perfect. I'll just give everyone a second to turn their camera on if they're open to being in the photo. See a couple more flashing on. Awesome. So I'm going to do a couple because I have 2 screens worth of people on camera. So I want to make sure I capture everyone, but I'll give us a 3, 2, 1. There's one. One moment, please. And now let's get screen 2. Everyone looking great. And we'll do, oops, sorry. 3, 2, 1. Perfect. Thanks so much, everyone.
Excellent. Thanks, Haley. Now everyone can move again, right? It's always that awkward. Is it done yet? So thank you for that. Now let's take a look at our agenda. So again, you would have received the agenda as well as the impressive bios of our wonderful speakers today, but we'll also add it to the chat box now along with some helpful documents of key terms. So today we'll do a brief overview of community wealth building as well as our specific topic for today, so community benefit agreements. Doug Pawson, the Executive Director of End Homelessness St. John's, will speak about how community wealth building and social finance has evolved in Ottawa. And we'll then hear from Elizabeth Chick of Buy Social Canada about how community benefit agreements have been implemented across the country, their successes and areas of opportunity. Lastly, Martin Adelaire, co-founder of the Ottawa Community Benefits Network, will share the local context of CBAs, so community benefit agreements, in Ottawa and our region, and share some upcoming areas for opportunity. All three of our speakers will then take part in a Q&A session moderated by Doug. So we ask that you keep your questions percolating in your brain as we hear from our speakers, with an opportunity to engage with them later in the event. So again, before we move on, I do want to pause and acknowledge our sponsor, RBC. They've been a major partner to United Way East Ontario for a number of initiatives, including those focused on community wealth building, and we sincerely thank you. We couldn't make this happen without their support. Okay, so are we ready? Let's jump into it. So today we're focusing on community benefit agreements. This is a complex topic, and we know that each of you joins today with a different level of understanding. Some of you are joining in for the first time, and others have been engaged in this work for a while. And many of us, if you're like me, are somewhere in between. So we want to put a poll up on this screen in just a moment to just gauge where's everybody at in terms of this conversation. And so what is your level of understanding when it comes to community benefit agreements? So Nora, I'll ask you to pop the poll up on the screen. And so considering this is my first exposure to the topic, I've heard about it and I'm intrigued to know more. I've had limited participation in developing or implementing CBAs. I've been involved in developing CBAs in my community, or I'm an expert on this topic. So I'll just give you a moment to take a look. And again, there's no right or wrong answers here. It's just based on your own experience. I see we have the majority of folks are getting in. We have a few more folks that we're waiting on. I'll give it another minute or so. Excellent, just waiting on a couple more folks. You got 10 more seconds. Excellent. Thank you for sharing, everyone. So here, let's share this out with the group. And so kind of seeing a mix of where everyone's at. So we have some who are first exposure and some who are experts, but really a lot of folks sitting in the middle. So I've had some limited exposure into community benefits agreements and looking to know more. So we're keen to have this conversation today and see if we can lift everyone's awareness on the topic, but also have the opportunity to start some conversations to learn from each other. So thank you for that. So let's start off with some context. So community wealth building is a people-centered approach to local economic development that aims to reorganize local economies so that wealth isn't extracted, but rather redirected back into communities. It's also partly focused on the economic power of local institutions to support local areas and their communities. Commonly referred to as anchor institutions, the way in which these large, locally rooted organizations, such as councils, hospitals, universities, colleges, and housing associations, as examples, spend their money, employ people, and use their land, property, and financial assets, can have a huge impact in the local area. So when we think about finance, really about increasing flows of investment within local economies by harnessing and recirculating the wealth that exists, as opposed to attracting capital, land and property. We want to deepen the function and ownership of local assets held by anchor institutions so that financial and social gain is harnessed by citizens in the local area. Spending. Utilize public sector procurement and commissioning to develop dense local supply chains of businesses, likely to support good employment and retain work locally. A generative economy. So develop and grow small, locally owned enterprises, which are more financially generative for the local economy. So really locking wealth into place. And workforce. Exercise fair employment practices and work to develop more just labor market to improve the prospects and well-being of local people. So as we think about community benefit agreements, they can have impacts based on the 5 pillars that we've just mentioned. So community benefit agreements are agreements typically involving developers of infrastructure and building projects, municipal or other governments, and community coalitions intended to achieve a broad range of socioeconomic outcomes for the community. In many countries, communities demand CBAs when new industrial, commercial, or institutional developments occur, or when public sector projects are built. CBAs have defined social value outcomes that will be delivered as part of a significant infrastructure or land development project, like building a hospital or a transit system. Through the CBA, the community, government, and developer agree upon the social value deliverables, such as job training, target hiring, living wages, buying local, ensuring affordable housing availability, and neighborhood revitalization. A CBA is a signed, legally enforceable agreement, having clear monitoring and enforcement mechanisms embedded within it. And as we think about this, it's really important to note that there can be many benefits to these strategies, but they're also complex, which is why we need to find ways to continue to work together and learn from each other in East Ontario. So we've seen some great examples of community benefit agreements here in Canada, a few of which might be familiar to you. So the Windsor-Detroit-Gordie Howe Bridge project is one, the Vancouver Olympic Village Park Urban Casino, Metrolinx Toronto agreement. More locally, we have the Manor Park redevelopment in Ottawa, as well as we have some potential opportunities that could be coming up locally, thinking about the Ontario Winter Games in Renfrew County, which have been rescheduled to 2023, or potentially Lansdowne 2.0, so the redevelopment in that area. So now I want to take the opportunity and I'm pleased to introduce you to Doug Pawson, the Executive Director of End Homelessness St. John's, a system change entity leading the development and implementation of the St. John's Community Plan to End Homelessness. Before joining End Homelessness St. John, Doug spent over 12 years in Ottawa working in community mental health. He led innovative and nationally recognized social enterprises and social finance programs through the significant periods of growth. Today, Doug is going to be sharing his experience in the early days of community wealth building here in Ottawa and highlighting the local journey and potential that we can leverage. Thanks, Doug, for joining us today, and over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Shannon. It's great to get the call from the United Way folks to do some presentation and reflect on some of the work that I was involved with, over the last decade and more. So it's really great for me to be able to join you and talk a bit about community wealth building. Now, I don't have controls, I don't think, of this presentation. So perfect. Okay. So I wanted to give some context and background because this concept of community wealth building was thrust upon me as I was learning a bit about community economic development. So I think George Brown, who's now the chair of the board for the United Way, was the one who was, leaving papers on my desks and articles on my emails, all back and forth, just talking about what community wealth was looking like in emerging out of the US at the time. And, George and I both have backgrounds in community economic development. And so I wanted to give some context because when I talk about these things, I come at it from that lens, right? This is an approach that's very intentional on generating community-led and owned solutions to address the needs of the community. So it's very similar in that context of building community wealth. So I took this definition from SEDNet because they're the national record, body sort of doing this work. But it's also sort of the education and work experience that has grounded so much of the work that we do, and it informs the work that I did before in Ottawa. And also, I think, back maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, we were, George and I and others in the community, we were sort of like pie in the sky. Like, what does community economic development look like for Ottawa? What does community wealth building look like for the city, for the community? Who should be the focus? And we have to kind of move the narrative away from just a poverty reduction strategy to more of an asset-based approach to poverty reduction. And that's kind of how I ground my thinking around CED, community wealth building. These are asset-based approaches, keep assets in the community, human, financial, capital in the community owned for community purposes in a really transparent and holistic way. So what did that look like? I sort of was brainstorming with folks, maybe Ottawa needs this CED corporation that's starting to emerge in a lot of the work that's coming out of the US around community wealth building. Like maybe there is a need for that specific type of focus. And so we were looking at this and sort of how do all the current actors play into this? And there's quite an opportunity, and that's really exciting to see how a lot of the work, even though it might seem or feel incremental or one-off, it does add up, and it can really add up to big systems change, which is really great. So that's just a bit of context on how I come at this concept of community wealth building and community economic development, and why I think it's so important to get the actors on the supply and the demand side working together and really focused on big audacious goals. So maybe we can forward to the next slide. So most of you will know, and I'm sure there's probably some folks here, maybe from Causeway, who know a bit about the social enterprise Get Nature Groundskeeping. So that was an enterprise that is owned by Causeway, sort of worked with Ottawa Community Housing to develop what they termed a value-added social enterprise weighting criteria to their procurement process. So here we have this large institution. I think OCH is still maybe the fourth largest community housing provider in the country, who saw potential. And so the image there from pilot to procurement just sort of documented that opportunity to go from, a very small, set aside funding, but with the intention of always getting to procurement. And how does somebody like like an institution like Ottawa Community Housing develop procurement and social procurement practices in a way that is, really intrinsic to the nature of the whole work that OCH does. So we worked for years to go from this pilot process to really, how do we develop a procurement process that reflects the values of the organization and the individuals that they serve. So social enterprise is one of the tools in the CED toolkit, right? Social enterprise often are, employment-based, but can be mission-based, and they can be supporting very marginalized folks in a community, either geographically or demographically, and they can take on opportunities to really do that workforce development, that the generative workforce and economy. Like, that's how you get more inclusion and full participation. So that was the tool that we used when we were developing that process with Ottawa Community Housing, and that kind of spun off and has had huge impacts for I know Causeway at the time when I was there, and continues to, and I think we're across the community. So if anybody is interested, there is a case study. I know it's on the SEDNet website if you were to Google that title, but you could read more about how they weighted social value as part of that procurement process. So again, social enterprise, social procurement, these are tools in the broader CED, community wealth building toolkit. So let's maybe move to the next one. So some of the key lessons from this, and I'm sorry, folks, I violated my own slide deck rule, which is inundate you with text, but I thought it was important. So some of the key lessons that we learned that I think were central to the advancement of the social procurement initiative within Ottawa Community Housing, as well as that piece around intentionality. They knew that they could do this as a set aside, but they didn't want it to only be a set aside. They wanted it to be a part of their practice. And so while we started as a set aside, in pilot, the intention has always been to provide supports, services that function alongside the business needs of the housing corporation. That was central to it. And alignment, this is also one of those really important things that if you really dig behind examples of social procurement around the country, alignment is really key. We had a similar mission. We supported folks who had been typically marginalized from the workforce, from the labor market. Many of those folks often lived in OCH properties or other housing providers across the community. And they knew that part of their goal as a corporation was to have that integration and participation of all of their residents. So that alignment was really key. And I think, again, where you've seen this really work, it's because you have clear alignment. So how might this apply at a more broader scale with, say, the city of Ottawa? If they have a CED strategy or goals that have that sort of piece to it, embedding procurement that aligns with that helps overcome the minutia of are we able to get around trade agreements, for example? So alignment is really, really critical. And of course, good business. The other thing too was this was not a charitable exercise for the housing corporation. OCH was very clear. If you can't do the job, then you're not going to have it. So that was a really important piece. And of course, if you're running a business, you want to be good at it. You want to be competitive. You want to make sure your customers are getting the best experience from your products or services. So we needed to make sure that we had our business case developed and fully fleshed out. So again, it wasn't a charitable activity, even though it was often done around the, supporting a procurement effort that was done or led, initiated by a charity or nonprofit. The activity itself was never charitable in nature. So that was how sort of that alignment, that intentionality, and that good business practice really work together to foster the ability for the Housing Corporation to say, how do we go from continual set-asides and pilots to actually embedding this into the values of our procurement system. So that was one of the pieces that we were excited that they took on as well, and they were always clear about that transition. If we go to the next slide there. So the factors, I think, for that are needed, I mean, these things kind of exist, but very fragmented. Finance, capacity building, land and development, workforce development, local economic development, like these ability to prioritize, neighborhoods or groups. These are so critical. And if you look around the community, you know who's doing finance at the community level, who's doing capacity building, where the land and development initiatives and activities are happening. Like all the actors on the supply and the demand side to make this work are already there. And I think, the opportunity is, how do you steer that ship in the right direction so everybody has alignment to these big, goals and work. And I think that's something that's really exciting for the community. I know it was really exciting when I was a part of it. And, the other thing too is nobody's doing this really great necessarily. They're doing it all together, but not necessarily coordinated. And, in the work that I do here in St. John's, everything is about coordination. Everything is about governance, good governance, transparency. These are things that, you can build really big North Star goals around. So those are some of the things that are needed and are already in place. And, to hear more about the coordination of how this is all coming together is going to be really exciting. I think that's all I have there. Yes, there you go. There's all the actors. There we go. Lots of folks doing lots of good stuff. And that's and that's, again, like, that's a testament to the work that all of you folks have been doing, and the ability to convene conversations like this to say, this is what's possible and how do we move forward with it. So I think I'm at my time. I'm not sure, Shannon, but
great. No, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Doug. And I know, already starting to kind of, again, percolate those thoughts about what are some questions we might have when we get into the Q&A portion afterwards. So again, we will see Doug back in a few moments along with our other speakers. So thank you so much for that. Now I'm going to take the opportunity to welcome Elizabeth Chick, the Executive Director of Buy Social Canada. Elizabeth coordinates and connects Buy Social Canada's work with public and private sector purchasers, including all levels of government, to design and implement social procurement and community benefit agreement policies and practices. Elizabeth worked with the City of Vancouver on the development of their CBA implementation strategy and is currently working with PCL Construction on the implementation of the CBA in New St. Paul's Hospital development, West Bank and Peak Construction on the 150 West Georgia Street project, and Chandos Construction on the implementation of a voluntary CBA on the First and Clark project. So Elizabeth, I'm going to pass the mic over to you to share about your experiences working on the community benefit agreements at a national level.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. I will try and stick to time as well as Doug did. My goodness, to the second. So I'm going to jump straight in. I also have got a lot of content on the slides as well, so hopefully useful for folks when they are sent around afterwards. So as we've mentioned, as has already been talked about, really today what we're looking at is this pathway of social procurement, looking at community benefit agreements. And this is really something that we're seeing emerging across the country. Looking at, as we're talking about community wealth building, what is the opportunity to look at employment, skills and training, social value in the supply chain, and broader community development goals as we are building infrastructure and development projects across the country. We're seeing policy, practice, implementation examples growing. And there's two kind of main ways that we can look at those. So some of the policies that we're seeing are looking at how do we leverage public infrastructure. So when we're having these large infrastructure projects publicly funded, what examples are we seeing of how we build in those employment, those social procurement opportunities? Again, won't have time to go into all of those in the 10-15 minutes we have, but I will touch a little bit more on Infrastructure Canada's Community Employment Benefit Initiative. And then looking at the private infrastructure development, so when it's a private project, what opportunity is there to leverage social value? So an example of policy here is the City of Vancouver's Community Benefit Agreement. It applies to private developments that are going through the rezoning process. And as I mentioned, we're 1 year into the first project that's triggered that policy, the City of Vancouver's, the New St. Paul's Hospital project. And so I'll go into a little bit more detail on that as well. And so, as I mentioned, we are seeing this momentum behind community benefit agreements growing. And so recently we conducted some research with the Trade and Apprenticeship Division of ESDC, looking at an assessment of opportunities and challenges of community benefit agreements. So this will be shared in the chat. And some of the case studies that I talk about a little bit more are featured in this, but I do just want to highlight some of the key findings that came out of that research. And I think it reflects a lot of what we've already started to talk about today. So what we found, the interviews went across a whole broad range of stakeholders, from folks in the construction sector, community benefit networks, other intermediaries, and government representatives. And we really saw an evolution of perspectives, a shift generally towards supporting community benefit agreements and recognizing the value and opportunity they create. Part of that is about, as Doug was mentioning, sort of the demand and supply side. We can see in our communities the opportunities that these CBAs create to allow folks to upskill, to reskill, retrain. We all know the impacts of COVID that's had on folks' opportunities for employment. But on the construction side as well, that sector is facing a lot of labour market pressures. So being able to articulate the benefits that exist there in opening up the pool of possible employees and opening up the pool of the supply chain as well. So again, one thing that came out of the research was, how do we continue to build this pool of research and experience? So that's why I'm excited to be here talking today about some of these examples, because like we said, none of these are currently happening perfectly, but we are learning from each project that happens. So how do we create these spaces where we share these learnings, share the opportunities and challenges to better build a CBA that works in our community? Because again, that was something else that was really highlighted that Doug mentioned as well, is that the fact that each community is different. And so we need to communicate, co-create, collaborate, and coordinate what this looks like in each community. Each community is going to be different in terms of the needs that that community has and the capacity that it has to deliver. Each project is different as well. So how do we better match the supply and demand across those projects? How do we co-create a roadmap for capacity building? So we like to say about setting targets that are attainable but aspirational. So once we know our community baselines, how do we build on that to create targets that are going to stretch us, and where we need to utilize those partnerships and networks to connect with those groups that are going to build capacity in the community? And then we also talked, I think, as mentioned as well, about the importance of the monitoring and reporting, because the more that we're monitoring and reporting, we're holding ourselves accountable, but we're also building these experiences of what those opportunities and challenges are. So to jump into what some of the key opportunities and challenges identified in some of these projects are so far, one of the key examples that some of folks might be familiar with already is Infrastructure Canada's Community Employment Benefit Initiative. So this is an initiative coming out of the federal government, out of Infrastructure Canada, and it applies to projects across the country where those projects are getting funding from the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Programme. And so the example I'm going to touch on a little bit more is in a small community in BC, but we're seeing projects across the whole country with this CEB initiative applied to it. And so where the CEB applies, there's a requirement to identify employment and procurement opportunities for at least 3 out of these 8 target groups. So the CEB doesn't set prescriptive targets. It actually explicitly recognizes that each community is different. And so it invites, where the CEB applies, for the community to identify what is the need that this community has and how can the CEB contribute to achieving that. So the example here, Regional District of Comox Valley, they had a water treatment facility that had the CEB applied. And so in this situation, the district asked proponents, so when they were responding to the bid, asked them to propose, establish, and report on the number of employment hours for the target groups identified. The CEB itself also doesn't include specific sort of compliance measures. It requires reporting, but it again is flexible in terms of what is that compliance mechanism. So in this situation, the district included a financial penalty. So if those targets hadn't been met, in the same way that if you say you're going to build a bridge or a building in a certain way and you don't, there'll be a financial penalty for that. There would be financial penalties for not meeting the targets that were set. But the targets were met and actually they were surpassed. And beyond that, the district also reported that despite those targets not only being met and surpassed, they saw no additional costs on the project as a result of those CEB requirements being included. And so the CEB model, also feedback shared, is that it's simple, clear, and easy for people to understand. Again, we sometimes hear, around the complexities that these models can include. So the language of the CEB is pretty accessible. But one of the other bits of feedback was that it can be difficult if we put the onus on the proponents to establish the targets. It can be really difficult for them to know what is the local context, what is the local need. So I think that really comes back to what was already being mentioned around that coordination and that co-creation. So we can see that one of the recommendations, for example, was that the government, but if we think beyond that, the proponents as well, should be collaborating with local employment support groups, local social enterprises, local training organizations, local community benefit networks to identify what are those local needs and what's the capacity and how do they set targets that are going to be aspirational but attainable. So the second case study is the City of Vancouver's Community Benefit Agreement policy. So this policy passed in 2018, and it applies to projects, private development projects that go through the rezoning process. It applies to large projects, so it's triggered by projects that are over 45,000 meters squared. And it applies, where it's triggered, it applies to the build and the operations phase of those developments. So the targets, there are set targets in the City of Vancouver CBA policy, and there's 3 targets. A local targeted employment, so 10% of new jobs being made available to folks who identify as being equity seeking, with a preference for those in Vancouver first. And then 10% of spend being spent locally and 10% of spend being spent socially. And the City of Vancouver have a toolkit that's available on their website. And within that, they define local based on postal codes. They have a list of what is included in social, and then also a list of equity seeking. And so some of these projects have already been mentioned. The City of Vancouver's CBA policy was developed based on over a decade of testing and piloting on a number of different projects. And the first project that's now triggered the CBA in its current form is the new St. Paul's Hospital development, which we have a year in now, so we have some data on that project. But again, and this is my slide where I have to apologize for all the words, but I wanted to give an overview of what that looked like, what the process involved is. So where the City of Vancouver CBA policy is triggered, the developer is informed of that and must sign the CBA prior to the rezoning enactment taking place. The compliance measure here is that it's tied to permitting. So in order to get your build permit, in order to get your operations permit, and to keep those permits, you have to show a plan of how you'll achieve the CBA targets, and then you have to report back on how you are achieving those targets as well. So the city has established for each project a project-specific working group that meets monthly. And at that group, the developer, the city, and an independent third-party monitor attend and discuss what is working on the project, what's not, and report out on where they're at in currently achieving those targets. So I wanted to also flag the role of independent third-party monitor here. So each project, the developer is required to hire an independent third-party monitor. That independent third-party monitor helps with the compliance aspect, so reviews the reports that come in, but it's also a broader role. It also plays a role in helping to achieve some of that coordination and connection. So it supports building relationships with local community benefit networks, with local employment groups, with local social enterprises, to help make sure that the developers who may not have some of those key relationships have a way of accessing those as they're looking at how they project they'll be achieving the CBA targets. So I mentioned that the first project that triggered it is this New St. Paul's Hospital project, multi-billion-dollar project in Vancouver, now a year in. And so just in the last sort of 2 minutes, just wanted to give a couple of examples of what are we seeing outcomes wise. And I have some numbers here, but also what stories do we have behind the numbers? So I mentioned that there's an employment target. And so the target is 10%. They're currently at 18% of new hires going to individuals who identify as being from an equity seeking group and local. So they are massively overachieving on that target right now. They are limited in some of the information that they can gather. So for example, because it's voluntary for folks to identify as being equity seeking, it's not possible to continuously track them along the project. So we don't know, for example, how many hours each individual has worked or how long they're on the project for. But what we have built in is anecdotal and qualitative research into this as well. So what are the stories behind some of these? So for example, when we look at the different types of roles that have been created, what are some of the examples that we can pull? What are some of the stories we can tell? So a security guard, for example, Embers, a social enterprise in Vancouver that provides day labor. An individual was hired from Embers to provide gatekeeper security, and that person expressed an interest in the construction sector more broadly. So that person got an employment opportunity through Embers to provide security services and is now actually being employed by PCL, and PCL is supporting them through an apprenticeship. So you can see that there was an initial employment opportunity created, and that individual has now potentially through the life, I think the project's about 4 or 5 years, will get pretty far in that apprenticeship through working on this project. Local and social procurement as well, 39% currently for local and 25% for social. But again, these numbers don't necessarily tell the full story. Some of this is larger spends with organizations that, including the City of Vancouver, that will be removed going forward, but also opportunities with things like catering. All of the trailers on site are being cleaned by a local social enterprise. So again, it's really amazing to start to see pulling out some of those examples around the social value and those opportunities in the supply chain that might not just be direct sort of shovels in the ground. So that's a really quick run through and update. I know I'm also at time, but these will be shared, and the research I think was also shared in the chat, and more than happy to follow up in the Q&A as well on any other examples.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Again, so helpful to see those examples brought to life, and where it could link to some of the things that may be happening or upcoming in our community as well. So again, looking forward to as well the questions that might come from the group when we get into the Q&A portion. So now I'd like to introduce Martin Adelaire, co-founder and member of the Ottawa Community Benefits Network, who helps to coordinate the OCBN activities. And since its founding in June 2019, Martin has helped the OCBN grow to over 30 member organizations. So Martin is retired from a career in the energy efficiency, energy management field, primarily as a consultant, and also with a stint in the federal government. Over the years, his clients included industry, all levels of government in Canada, utilities, and international organizations such as the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Canadian International Development Agency. So Martin is going to share with us the local context of community benefit agreements and opportunities for our region to grow into the immense opportunities that CBAs present us in the coming years. So Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Shannon. It's a pleasure to be here today. I apologize for that terrible screenshot. I think you can all see my receding hairline. I want to thank United Way for organizing this event, and also to thank United Way for being a big supporter of our organization, including financial support. We really appreciate that. And I also want to thank the Community Foundation of Ottawa for being a financial supporter of the OCBN. I want to also thank all of our Community Benefit Network members, several of whom are attending today. They're really what makes this network function and provide the drive and energy for success. And I want to thank, finally, George Brown, Chair of the Board of Directors, United Way, who I think everyone can probably fairly say is the straw that stirs the drink. And thank you, George, for being a co-founder of the network and supporting us through this process. So today we're going to talk about what we're doing here in Ottawa, the opportunity, how to take advantage of it, and how to use community benefit agreements as the platform for success. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to start with the context here in Ottawa. I've used this metaphor in the past. We're in the middle of a construction hurricane. I think it's going to last for many, many years. I don't know about you, but my head feels like it's on a swivel sometimes trying to keep track. But we know that here in Ottawa, we have major federal institutions with significant real estate portfolios. We have LeBreton Flats, in particular in the short term, the development of the entertainment stadium districts. We have the new Civic Hospital campus, LRT phases, next phases 3 and 4, and a wide host of private developments. Next slide, please. So what does this mean in terms of the opportunity? The end goal for communities in Ottawa is to achieve a wide range of community benefits from these projects. And these benefits can flow along 3 pathways as shown in this slide. First of all is to build in, hardwired into the concept and design certain critical outcomes, in particular with respect to affordability, residential affordability, commercial affordability, and sustainability, energy sustainability, as well as a wide assortment of other ecological outcomes. This is hugely important at the kind of concept and design stage. I think some of you will be aware that in the past week, the City of Ottawa just released its Affordable Housing Capital Strategy report. And leafing through that report, we can see that over 12,000 households are currently on the centralized wait list for affordable housing. We can also see that if you're in the at or below the 30th income percentile, there are 0 affordable options for you today in Ottawa. So you can see at the concept and design stage why that's important. Then there's a whole array of community benefits that can flow during the construction phase. Elizabeth did a really fine job of illustrating the kinds of benefits that can accrue here through workforce development, job readiness initiatives, and through social procurement. And then finally, once these facilities and buildings are built, the benefit streams can continue. And Doug pointed to Ottawa Community Housing and the landscaping services. That's just a prime example of what you can achieve at the operations level. So the opportunity from the billions of dollars that are going to be spent in Ottawa over the next 25 years with respect to community benefits are enormous. Next slide, please. So what's the case for a community benefits agreement approach? Community benefits agreement is a platform. It's a framework, first and foremost, for accountability. The reason why the CBA movement is growing in North America is that communities at the grassroots level are asking for more robust accountability in achieving and seeing community benefits from these kind of projects. Secondly, a CBA is a platform for grassroots community voices and aspirations to be meaningfully brought into the process, not only at the early stages, but all the way through to monitoring and evaluation and oversight. Thirdly, CBAs are a platform for innovation, for social innovation in particular. And finally, CBAs can be structured to be there for the long haul, so that they're there for the build out, the rollout of multifaceted, multi-year construction and infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. So what's the second dimension to the case for CBAs? Well, first of all, from an economic benefit standpoint, it pays off. Every dollar that's spent on construction and operational spend generates multiples of economic benefits. Elizabeth just provided you some examples from the St. Paul's Hospital. And it works. Canada and the United States to date, there are 400 CBAs in place or being negotiated. We're not starting from a blank slate here, folks. There's lots of experience, as Elizabeth mentioned, that we can draw on. Next slide, please. So about our network. We're a volunteer network of over 30 member organizations, and our mission is to apply CBAs to developments to build inclusive, equitable, diverse, healthy, and sustainable communities where all walks of life can live, work, and prosper. Next slide, please. So how do we do it? What is the CBA life cycle? Well, first of all, our network's philosophy is that we want to work with grassroots communities and give them a platform and support and resources to build their own characterizations of what they want to achieve from projects. Also, we want to use our goodwill to collaborate and co-create with institutions and developers. So the first phase of the CBA life cycle is outreach, awareness, and building relationships. This is important. It takes time. It's been challenging, in particular during COVID, and then of course the occupation, but we're working our way through these challenges. The second stage is negotiation and building the agreement. And then the final stage is implementation. And as you can see from Elizabeth's examples, using the Vancouver CBA policy, they have a very robust monitoring and evaluation structure, which enables one to then tweak and modify and adapt as you continue to go forward. Next slide, please. Our network has also developed an agreement architecture designed for success. Our agreement architecture is designed to build and sustain the relationships through goodwill and inclusivity, to give the grassroots community voices in Ottawa a home, to be flexible, recognizing there are opportunities in both the short and long term, and to enable an evolution from general commitments to specific commitments and targets over time. In other words, we recognize that you don't have to walk in on day one and be 100% prescriptive on the outcomes and the targets, but this is going to take time and there's going to be give and take. And finally, and very importantly, our CBA architecture works for all kinds of land development models: land sale, lease, P3, and own build. And I should note, as Doug mentioned in his presentation, and as Shannon mentioned, that land and property is one of the key pillars of community wealth building. And this is really a central theme to what we're trying to achieve here in Ottawa, given the enormous real estate portfolios that the federal government and other institutions have in the city. Next slide, please. So what have we achieved? On LeBreton Flats, we first formed with a sole focus on the LeBreton Flats redevelopment. And even though we've now repurposed our mission to all of Ottawa, LeBreton Flats is still a major priority. We provided input on community benefit outcomes, some of which worked their way into the tender requirements for the first land parcel that's being developed, referred to as the library parcel. We are building a relationship with the winning consortium for that development, led by Dream Assets. We've also been working with the city on identifying the community benefits priorities for LeBretons from the city's standpoint, and they released a report last fall. We're working very closely with the Atisoke Joint Facilities Project, and particularly on two benefit streams: social procurement for the food services and looking at a possible workforce development initiative. We are currently in the final stages of developing a community benefits agreement with Ottawa Community Housing. And I should say that Toronto Community Housing has really taken a major leadership role outside of Ottawa in really pushing the CBA model. And as alluded to earlier, the Manor Park redevelopment, the official plan application was approved by council. That included an MOU with affordability commitments. And it also includes, for the first time in the city of Ottawa, a reference to developing on a voluntary basis a community benefits agreement. And finally, at some point, there will be a community benefits committee struck for the Herongate redevelopment, and OCBN has been invited to sit on that committee. Next slide, please. So, other campaigns that we are rolling out, aside from LeBreton Flats, well, in the short term, we'll be focusing on the Entertainment Stadium District. Canada Lands Company, where we'll be focusing both on the Confederation Heights and the Tunney's Pasture redevelopments. Civic Hospital, new campus, LRT. And we're working with the Somerset Community Health Center, Somerset West Community Health Center, on development of a community benefits framework for West Centertown. Next slide, please. So I know I'm running out of time, but again, whether it's public land redevelopment or whether it's entertainment stadium districts, you name it. There are examples across North America. So let's just look, for example, when we think about reimagining entertainment stadium districts as platforms for generating a diversity of community benefits in Ottawa. Look at the precedents in place. Elizabeth has already referred to the Olympic Village and casino redevelopments. We have the Toronto Casino Woodbine redevelopment. We have a whole assortment of stadium developments, Pittsburgh Penguins, the Atlanta Falcons football deal, soccer stadiums in Cincinnati and St. Louis, and currently under negotiations, CBAs relating to the Buffalo Bills football stadium, and then a whole entertainment stadium district around the Nassau Long Island Memorial Coliseum. These are just examples. Next slide, please. So I want to kind of close off by shouting out on emerging CBA leadership in Ottawa. First of all, among our members. Secondly, among the Etisoke JFP team, including staff from Ottawa, City of Ottawa, and Library and Archives Canada. Particular shout out to Jennifer McCabe at the City of Ottawa. Lalit Agrawal, CEO, Manor Park Holdings. Lalit is breaking new ground, and we really have to give credit to him as a private developer in Ottawa to put himself out there and his company out there on Manor Park with respect to the MOU that was negotiated with the city and with respect to committing to the process to develop on a voluntary basis a community benefits agreement. Councillors Ralston King and Sean Menard, who publicly support community benefit agreement approaches. Councillor King on Manor Park. Councillor Menard, who's going to be hosting a CBA town hall on Confederation Heights this week, Thursday. The Manor Park residents who are going to be participating on a CBA working group. Acorn and the Herongate community who were involved in pushing for a CBA on that redevelopment. Several senior staff, City of Ottawa, Ottawa Community Housing, Stéphane Giguère and Cliff Udale for working with us on the CBA. And again, our friends at United Way, CFO, and the Ottawa Community Loan Fund. Next slide, please. So how can you help? Lots of options. You can join our network formally, or you can collaborate with us on specific campaigns and advocacy. You can help us increase awareness and understanding across the city, and we're open to other suggestions. Next slide, please. So thank you. Here's how you can get in touch with us and a link to our website, and I really appreciate the opportunity. This is our town hall on Thursday, and the link to register. I think that's it, folks. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Martin, for sharing the local context and the opportunities that exist to leverage community benefit agreements. So now we are going to have a chance to speak again to our presenters today. So I'm going to pass things back to Doug Pawson for the next segment of our event. Doug is going to field questions from the audience. And again, we invite any of our experts to answer, including yourself, Doug, of course. And you can feel free to put questions in the chat, so we'll watch there, or feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you in order. And so, Doug, over to you.
All right, great. Yeah, thanks, Shannon. Thanks, Martin. Thanks as well, Elizabeth. It's great to see all this work happening, in Ottawa and around the country, and highlighting that. So it was really a great set of presentations to get us going. So as Shannon mentioned, I can take the questions if folks want to raise their hand, or post things into the chat function, either to everyone or just to me directly. Feel free. And while you folks are thinking of questions or deciding whether or not you want to raise your hand or put something in the chat box, I do have a couple of questions. And in part, Martin, we talked last week in the lead up to this, and you mentioned something really interesting, and it was really, sort of the like what are the financial costs of doing this type of work versus the economic costs, and how do we change our mindset to be strictly first, I guess, from one set to another, and how do we think about that more in a more unique way, I guess, in terms of the work we're doing. So I'll let you start with that, Martin, and then we'll get to Alem. I believe you have your hand up.
Okay, well, I think Elizabeth should jump in as well, because she's already provided some good data on that front using her examples. But I think that it's a very good question, and I think people often get confused between financial benefits and costs and economic benefits and costs. So yes, there will be some very small incremental financial costs to all players in working their way through the 3 stages that I showed in my slides: the relationship building, the development of a CBA, and then the implementation and the oversight of the CBA. And it's important to understand that, unlike in Vancouver or even in Toronto, in the city of Ottawa, we don't have an institutional context. We don't have a policy or programs focused on CBA. So what we find transactionally is that we're always kind of starting from square one on a project by project basis. But nevertheless, the experience coming out of Canada and the US shows that the financial incrementality in terms of costs is very, very small. However, the economic net benefits are enormous, and they generate enormous multipliers through each of the benefit streams that have been illustrated by Elizabeth and myself and others. And I think just my final comment is, I had given Lalit Agrawal a shout out earlier, and I think he and other developers are starting to understand the value proposition for getting out ahead on community benefits agreements. And it goes far beyond improving their brand. It's access to labor where there are labor shortages. It's social innovation and a whole lot of other benefits that make them more competitive, particularly when they're bidding on public projects. So over to you, Liz.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo a lot of what Martin said. We said the more we're seeing this put into practice, we are seeing examples where it doesn't cost more. So that quote from the CEB implementation, for example, they said there was no increase in cost through the successful implementation. I think to Martin's point, as we see it develop, if we're setting ourselves these aspirational targets and we're growing and developing over time, yes, there may be some of those costs in terms of that coordination and collaboration, but then what are those multiplier effects that we see from that? I think it was Vancouver Island Regional Construction Association found twice as many local jobs created where it was a local business rather than a sort of large out-of-town business. Loco BC, 3 times as much reinvested locally where it's a small local stationery company used rather than a big multinational corporation. So when we frame the financial terms in that perspective, and when we think, if the owner is a municipality or a government, the ripple on effects of what's achieved through that. But no, we are seeing some examples now of where it's not costing more. Tim Caldwell from Shandos, another general contractor that are really big proponents of social procurement, he says the same thing, where it's done well, it doesn't cost more. And yes, there's going to be situations where we're sort of learning and iterating, but that's really why we have these conversations now, is to work out what are those situations where it didn't cost more, what is working well.
Great, thanks for kicking that off. Alema, over to you.
Hi, thank you for sharing this wonderful information. and great vision for community building. Okay, so with vision comes plan, strategies, and more things, right? Building a team. Martin, what were your challenges bringing, the leadership team, or if you try to take some kind of action, where do you get the budget? Was there help from the city of Ottawa? I'm not sure what kind of. Definitely, you had a lot of challenges, bringing those influential people, to start. So, would you answer those, please?
Thank you, LM. I didn't quite hear everything that you asked, but I think just to paraphrase, you were asking about what were some of the challenges that we were facing, and in particular, did we get any help from the city of Ottawa? Okay. So, I think that the challenges are multifaceted. I mean, first of all, you have to increase awareness and understanding among communities and among decision makers and key stakeholders and elected officials and institutions as to what community benefits agreements, what they are, what they bring to the table, how they work, and how they can be implemented. So that takes time and effort. We, as I said earlier, we have been supported by United Way and Community Foundation to enable us to partially resource our ability to deliver on the various campaigns that are underway or emerging. But we're far from where we need to be on that front. The city of Ottawa has been very cooperative in terms of trying to figure out how to make this work on a project by project basis in the absence of any policy or program framework, and also recognizing that in the province of Ontario, it's more challenging to bring into play the kind of policy that we have in Vancouver. The provincial legislation has a little more elbow room than it does in Ontario. The other major challenge is to bring our federal institutions who have enormous real estate portfolios in Ottawa to kind of meet us halfway on opening their eyes to the possibilities that a CBA lens could bring. And we have lots of goodwill to continue to figure out how to work with them and co-create with them. But that's been a big challenge. And as I said, during dealing with COVID and the occupation and now the storm, and I keep throwing various hoops and hurdles into the process.
Just quick question, follow-up. How long it took you, or was there a specific group with urgency, excitement for you that helped you, to, excite, let's do it together, right? With there, I know United Way, but did you find, was it easy to find or hard to find? If you, and partly if you make the urgency, the problem, visually present the challenge, then people will understand you, if you present the truth, right? So were you able to find those kind of people?
Well, we have, our network comprises over 30 member organizations. And these organizations are from a wide diversity of sectors in the city. So we have the Somerset West Community Health Center. We have organizations that are focused on affordable housing and dealing with the homelessness issue. We have organized labor representatives. We have the Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition and the Gignal Housing Corporation. We have community associations. So, I think by virtue of the strength and expertise of our member organizations, as well as other allies such as ACORN and the Provincial Building Trade Council, we have a great mobilization of support, and we can bring that knowledge and expertise to bear on a community by community basis, a project by project basis. And that's what we're trying to do right now in Manor Park.
Great, thanks, Martin. Thanks, Alam. We have another question in the chat here from Jimmy Pan, and I'll throw this to you, Elizabeth, first, and then Martin. And I think I have something on this one too. So the question is what was the biggest challenge or pain point? Also, was there an unanticipated time delay that can easily be overlooked?
You want to kick us off, Doug? You've got some thoughts on that?
No, you go ahead. You go ahead. In the CBA development, in terms of developing those frameworks, I think, what's your experience on that front then?
Yeah, so in terms of the challenges, I think thinking about some of those specific examples that I highlighted, really a lot has been learned even in a year. I mentioned that the City of Vancouver has an implementation framework. So really from some of the examples we've looked at, they're kind of the most mature in terms of the toolkit that they have and the project specific working group. And even still, there's been challenges over this last year, which is just part of the implementation process. So I mentioned, for example, that they have a reporting requirement on employment. But it's a challenge getting that information when we're trying to get sensitive data from folks. So that's definitely been a challenge. I think to Martin's point as well, even getting folks understanding that language around what is the community benefit agreement, what's the targets, what does it look like in practice. But I think that's where I would note the value of the project specific working group that is being set up. I know, Martin, you spoke about some of the projects you're looking at with the Community Benefit Committee, and even having the CBN with such a diverse range of stakeholders. And I think that really is one of those key solutions to those challenges. We're not going to find the perfect CBA. There's definitely going to be challenges. So I think it's about establishing in that design process what's the space where those challenges are discussed and identified, so that they can be a solution co-created together. So I think that would be one of the biggest challenges. The research as well, that was, again, a really interesting opportunity to look at, not just the opportunities, but actually hear from a range of stakeholders what were some of those key challenges. So some of those ones I mentioned, from the sector around that previously some of those examples weren't best practices. Community benefit was kind of tacked on at the end, and they were told, okay, you have to add this now once they've already done their bid. So I think there was a number of really interesting challenges identified in that research. And really that's where, again, that solution came out of it, which was, well, this is where we need to be having that communication, that co-creation, and that collaboration, so that we are looking at how do we work on those challenges together.
And maybe just quickly, because Jim just put it in there, how are baselines defined?
So the baselines being defined, so for the City of Vancouver, they've got those kind of prescriptive targets. That was based off of some best practice research. I mentioned those sort of 10 years that they were looking at. But what's interesting is that, again, in that CBA policy, they've identified that will go back to council every few years for review, because we're going to be learning more about those baselines as they change. A great example of trying to measure baselines that you might want to look up online is the City of Surrey's CEB implementation. So they, in their design of their CEB, actually did a whole series of stakeholder engagements where they engaged with local businesses, local trades, local Indigenous nations to identify what were they considering setting the targets at, what were the current baselines, and then the targets they set, you know, on paper. I think one of the targets around SME procurement, they set it at 50%, but it was because they'd established that baseline of being 35%. So in terms of defining or establishing the baselines, it's really about looking at what are you going to be trying to measure, and doing that engagement and stakeholder outreach to establish those numbers.
Great, thanks. And Martin, anything to build on those points with respect to, you know, the pain points and things that could cause potential time delays on your side in your experience?
I don't think I have anything to add to what I've already described, some of the challenges. Yeah.
Okay. I know.
Martin, can I add
oh,
something?
Please go. Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
It's Richard Hayter. I just wanted to mention to everyone on the line that on June the 13th, 2018, the Government of Canada passed Bill C-344, which was in fact an act to amend the Department of Public Works and Government Services Act, in brackets, community benefits, aimed at providing the authority to require an assessment of community benefits in federal procurements to ensure that the tax dollars invested in the repair and building of federal infrastructure were leveraged to produce local benefits such as training and jobs. Now, from that point on, the Minister of Public Services, Carla Qualtrough, made every effort from that day forward to have this passed by the Senate. And unfortunately, that never happened. But she did have a letter sent out, and I have a copy of it, that was advising all of the Public Service and Procurement Canada to adopt this. And with over 600 projects a year in Ottawa, we still need to work on this, revitalizing the Bill C-344. But to go back to a question Doug asked, Statistics Canada does an analysis every year of the jobs created for every $1 million invested in non-residential construction. And that can be up to 7 individuals. For every $1 million, that would be 7 jobs created. And when you add to that the indirect and the so you had a direct, indirect, and induced jobs. It's huge. And then you take the salaries earned and the multiplier effect that Elizabeth mentioned, it becomes a huge benefit to the community. It's a small business. And we've had this discussion today with the vice chair of the Ottawa Board of Trade to see how they can become involved to support this and to push some of this legislation forward. So I just wanted to mention that date. And I think, Martin, we've been talking about this since the 12th of June, 2018. So congratulations on what you've accomplished. The committee is doing a marvelous job, and I see success for many, many, many Ottawa citizens in the efforts you've been making. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the comment there, Richard. I don't know if Martin, you wanted to mention anything on that, or Liz, but no.
No, I mean, I think, you know, clearly, I mean, one of the challenges is resources. I mean, having budgets not only to operate, but also to do proper baselining and evaluation. It costs money to do evaluation properly. So the kind of stats that Richard is referring to from Stats Canada, that's important, but we want to be able to evaluate on individual CBAs, you know, the benefit streams, evaluating the way that Elizabeth is presenting in terms of St. Paul's hospital. But that requires commitment of financial resources from institutions in the same way that they evaluate all kinds of other programs, as you know, Doug. So that's what we need for the CBA world.
Great. So I have been told that we need to wrap up the Q&A portion. So I will take my lead from the United Way team, but I did want to say thank you, Martin. Thank you, Elizabeth, for this. And a big thanks to the United Way East Ontario team, Preeti, Noor, Renatha, Shannon, Haley, who I've talked to on this project, but I know there's more of you on the call, and you guys do great work, and it's really, really great to be part of the conversation with you folks. So with that, over to you, Shannon.
Excellent. Thank you so much to you, Doug, Elizabeth, and Martin, for sharing your insights and expertise and how to access your resources throughout the conversations today. And to those who brought up some really great questions. And again, I know we've placed quite a few great pieces of information in the chat today. And I want to remind you that you can save the chat by selecting the 3 dots in the chat function and choosing Save Chat. So it will save the public, not the private, chat to your advice. And we'll also share everything that was all the resources and links and whatnot in our post-session email. So, but if you want to grab it today, you can. And again, these webinars, as we saw and through the conversation that we just had, are really meant to engage, educate, and inform. But we also see how much more we can dig into the conversation. So I want to encourage you to get involved in our champions table or look for other opportunities to attend events like this to keep moving forward and collaborating in this space. As we wrap our final webinar in this series, we want to acknowledge that many of you have joined us throughout this ongoing conversation, which really started last fall with the community conversations around the Ontario Winter Games in Renfrew County, as well as the Community Wealth Building Summit. Coming together to learn and reimagine how we work together in our communities to build stronger spaces for everyone will be an important part of our approach to an equitable economic recovery in East Ontario. And as a reminder, you can check out or revisit each of the learning sessions online via the link that will be shared in the chat, as well as in the post-session email. But let's reflect on our learning journey over the last few months. So in March, when we met to discuss social procurement and purchasing, David Lepage from Buy Social Canada helped us set the foundation as to not just why we as individuals and organizations need to participate in this reimagined workplace, or marketplace, but shared insight on how we can actually make that happen. David explained the social value marketplace, how we can buy and sell while creating a positive impact, and how to put those concepts into action. Then we heard from Ian Carswell at the Black Tartan Kitchen in Lanark County to understand how his business has thrived using a buy local strategy and how he manages his day-to-day operations in this model. And lastly, Andrea Pierce shared the opportunities that we have to engage and lift marginalized populations through community wealth building strategies. We need to do the work as a community to empower all segments of our population to participate within this evolving context. During our conversations about the equitable workforce, the team at RBC was able to share how we're building strategies and reinforcing activities that help attract and retain more diverse workforces. They were also able to share the positive impact that this has had on their business operations as well as customer experience models. Haley Heckman highlighted the importance of social enterprise in developing an equitable workforce, using the businesses at Causeway Work Center as examples and highlighting important research that guided them and can guide us as we move forward. Finally, we heard from the leaders of the United Way East Ontario employment initiatives, so Ohio, EARN, and the Indigenous Employment Table, who shared the opportunities to attract and retain more diverse talent in our communities and the resources that are available to employers. They also uncovered some of the work that is ahead if we truly want to be able to align the supply and demand sides of talent using the community wealth building models. And in today's session, we focused on community benefit agreements. So again, we learned more about this in-depth approach to community wealth building, the history of community economic development in Ottawa and the surrounding region, how CBAs are deployed both nationally and locally, and the business case for developers, governments, and communities to support CBAs. So as we think about stepping away from the webinar series and back into our day-to-day, what are some things that we can each do to drive these principles as we move forward? So we ask that you participate in community consultations about large projects and inform others, such as our United Way team, of these opportunities so we can promote community wealth building principles. We want to consider applying the principles of community wealth building into our everyday operations. Join the Community Wealth Building Champions table, as I mentioned earlier. Visit our United Way East Ontario Community Wealth Building landing page to learn more and keep up to date on what is happening. And so again, the links will be in the chat in just a moment. Connect with local resources and buy local when possible, both from an organizational as well as an individual standpoint. Connect with United Way East Ontario's employment initiatives like Hire Immigrants Ottawa and the Employment Accessibility Resource Network to access more diverse talent pools. And complete our survey to give some feedback on the conversations today, but also to help inform how we move forward as a community. So again, thank you so much to everyone who has attended today. We're extremely grateful to RBC who has empowered us to do this work. And of course, thank you to our presenters, Doug Pawson, Elizabeth Chick, and Martin Adelaire. Also, thank you to my colleagues who have made everything come together for today's session and really ensured that behind the scenes, everything went as smoothly as possible. So again, have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone. Thank you so much. And we will be sharing more resources from today's session, as well as other resources related to community wealth building in our communities here in East Ontario. Have a wonderful afternoon.